Hello, my name is Jacqueline Pollauf, and today I wanted to provide an overview of the harp part from Choral Hymns from the Rig Veda, Opus 26, Group 3 by Gustav Holst. This is a really beautiful work which Holst wrote for treble voices and harp, so the same instrumentation as Benjamin Britten's A Ceremony of Carols. And it's a short work, about 12 to 15 minutes, and it's a suite consisting of 4 short pieces. The harp part is quite challenging but well written, and the complete part can be found in my publication, Choral Repertoire, Harp Parts. And today what I wanted to do was start by providing some background information about the piece, and then we'll look at each movement in depth. I'll demonstrate a few passages, talk about some practice approaches, and some things to be aware of when performing the piece with choir. And after that, I'll talk a little bit more about the part that I've included in my book, how I worked out the page turns, some of the cues that I've added, and also some of the harp-specific information that's included. Gustav Holst is best known for his orchestral suite, The Planets, which of course includes 2 harps. And much like the piece that we're looking at today, those harp parts are both challenging and rewarding to play. The Choral Hymns from the Rig Veda was written before The Planets, and this work comes from Holst's Sanskrit period, when he was really interested in ancient Indian religion and poetry. Musically, he was especially inspired by the Rig Veda, which is a collection of ancient Indian sacred hymns. And Holst actually learned Sanskrit himself so that he could create his own English translation of some of the hymns and then set them to music. So the reason why this piece has such a long title, Choral Hymns from the Rig Veda, Opus 26, Group 3, is that there are also Groups 1, 2, and 4, but none of those use harp. This work, of course, is written for treble voices and harp, but Holst did specify that instead of harp, piano could be used. And the premiere took place in 1911 with the Blackburn Ladies Choir, conducted by Frank Duckworth, in the town of Blackburn in England. The first movement is called Hymn to the Dawn, and it's pretty straightforward musically. It's written in the time signature of 4/4 with a tempo marking of andante, and helpfully the harp plays the same thing 3 times. In the harp part, it starts with 8th note arpeggios, and the right hand uses standard intervals, but the left hand does span a pretty big range and uses some awkward intervals in there. So there's 12 measures of those 8th note arpeggios, then a short rest, and then the harp has a sweeping arpeggio of 32nd notes up the harp. And then all of that repeats twice more. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate a couple bars of the 8th note arpeggios and then the 32nd note arpeggio as well. When it comes to learning and practicing this part, I think it can be helpful to work with the left hand alone, since it's playing constant 8th notes and it has kind of an unusual part. So I think really practicing that to make sure that all of the awkward intervals are very comfortable and automatic is a great first step. From there, adding the right hand in chords while the left hand plays its part as written works really well for a next step. I'll demonstrate a little bit of that starting in measure 3. And that can help to really build up the coordination, which is quite helpful because when the hands are playing both as written, so the last step in this practice approach, the placing is happening at different times. So it is a challenging part to coordinate between the hands. And then the sweeping 32nd note arpeggio is quite straightforward. It's just the same inversion and the same notes throughout. And of course, practicing it in some classic ways in block chords and then as arpeggios, but with altered rhythms would be a great approach. The second movement is called Hymn to the Waters, and it's marked allegro. For most of it, the harp is playing descending 32nd note arpeggios, trading off between the hands. For a small portion in the middle, the harp switches to slower arpeggios with octaves in the left hand before returning to those descending arpeggios. And stylistically, it's actually a similar compositional approach to the Waltz of the Flowers cadenza. There's a few challenging aspects to the harp part. For one, the tempo is quite quick. Secondly, most of the arpeggios are just continuous. There's very few long notes or rests throughout the movement. And then a lot of them are also up in this highest register, which is a bit awkward to play in. So there's definitely some challenges to the harp part here. Another important thing to note is the time signature. The harp is written in the time signature of 7/4, and the choir, really unusually, is in 21/8, so 3 eighth notes per beat. So both the choir and the harp are essentially in 7, just written differently. And although that's a little bit complicated, it does flow together pretty smoothly as long as both the choir and the harp are feeling that same quarter note pulse. And helpfully, the harp begins the movement and has the first couple of measures solo, so the harpist can really set that up and set up a nice, strong pulse and feel for the choir to then enter and match. I'll go ahead and play a couple measures from the beginning and then a little bit from that contrasting middle section as a demonstration. In practicing this, all of the standard approaches that you might use with the Waltz of the Flowers cadenza or something similar would work really well. So it can be great to start with block chords just to really learn the patterns and have everything under the fingers. Then from there, playing it in arpeggios but using altered rhythms such as a dotted 8th and 16th note rhythm, or the opposite of that can work really well. And one great thing about this is that Holst is using really standard voicings. A lot of this is just working through root position 7th chords and inversions. So many of the patterns are quite obvious and do fall under the hands really nicely. That's great since it has to go so quickly, which can be a challenging part of practicing, gradually speeding up the tempo until everything feels really comfortable at that quick tempo. The third movement is the longest and most musically complex of the movements in the suite. It's called the Hymn to Vina, and throughout it the harp is doing a few different things. At the start, the harp is playing 8th note arpeggios, but using the fingering of 1 and 3 at the same time, and then 2 and 4 at the same time, and then in the left hand trading off that way. So generally with 5th and 6th coming down the harp, using that very specific harp fingering. From there, we have passages of large chords, and Holst specifies through a footnote that these chords should not be broken or arpeggiated as would be normal, but instead just played all simultaneously. In the middle of the movement, there's a short harp cadenza with some arpeggios working their way down and back up the harp, and then a melody in the right hand accompanied by more arpeggios in the left hand. And then we go through a lot of that material in slightly different ways, again, to finish out the movement. The tempos change throughout the movement. This is the only movement with that, so that can also be an added challenge. We start at an adagio tempo, but as the movement goes along, we move to andante con moto, and then there's an accelerando, and then an allegro passage, then back to the adagio, then another short accelerando and a più mosso, and another accelerando to finish. So some of this material you play at once in the first part of the movement, all at the adagio tempo, and then when it returns, or something similar to it that returns, it's now at the faster tempo or with an accelerando. So all of that is quite a bit to keep track of and can be rather challenging. I'm going to jump around and play a few different passages from this to try to cover those different elements. I described the arpeggios coming down with the specialty fingering, the chords, and then a little bit of the cadenza. When it comes to practicing this movement, one approach would be to go through first and play all of the similar sections back to back. So all of the descending arpeggio passages one after another, then going back through and playing all of the chord passages one after another, and so forth. And I think that the descending arpeggio passages are quite challenging. I was mentioning the 1-3-2-4 fingering earlier, which is really a standard approach for those. But in some of the measures, Holst changes the intervals and sevenths are included. So in those, it might be worth exploring a different fingering or perhaps jumping from interval to interval there. Another thing to keep in mind with those passages is that they're quite complex harmonically, so there are many pedal changes, and that can also be a bit of a challenge. Most of the chord sections are more straightforward and are using really standard voicings, but in some places, Holst expands the voicings and the chords become quite large. And then the cadenza leaves a little bit of room for artistic freedom, which is quite satisfying. That's really, I think, a fun passage to practice. And then perhaps after working through all of these different similar sections back to back and making sure that everything is really solid and feeling comfortable, at that point it would be great to put it all back together in order, but really focus in on the various tempo changes, as that can be a challenge both for the harpist on their own and, of course, with putting it together with the choir. The final movement is the Hymn of the Travelers, marked at moderato and written in the time signature of 5/4. And throughout this, the harp is providing a really stable backdrop for the voices. In fact, the harp has the same type of pattern and exact same rhythm in almost every measure, with both hands kind of working up and down the harp, and then the harmonies and the intervals changing throughout the piece. I'll go ahead and play a few measures from the start of the piece as an example. So of course there are some challenges to all of this. For one thing, both hands are jumping between all of these different groups, so keeping track of that visually is quite a bit to deal with. And then the changing intervals as the piece progresses, particularly in the left hand, adds some challenges. There's also the tempo, which, although Holst describes it as moderato, feels kind of fast to keep all of this going. And then this movement is very constant, again, similar to the second movement. There's a couple of fermatas throughout it, but otherwise everything just keeps going almost relentlessly. And so it's really demanding for the harpist to put all of that together for this final movement. In practicing it, similarly to the first movement, I think it could be great perhaps to start with the left hand and work on that pattern and all of those jumps, and then add the right hand in gradually. Again, you could first add the right hand in just playing those notes in chords rather than breaking them up between the patterns, and then gradually build it up to the two hands the way that they're written. Finally, I think when putting it together with choir, those couple of fermatas that I mentioned can be a bit of a challenge. They fall in the middle of the measure, and then the harp re-enters first before the choir moves. So that's really a spot to be very connected with the conductor and ready for whatever length they might make that fermata. Here we have my edition of the harp part to choral hymns from the Rig Veda. And as I mentioned, this is from my publication, Choral Repertoire, Harp Parts. This is the complete part, and in putting it together, I did not alter what Holst wrote or simplify the part in any way, but I was trying to make it clear and easy to read and kind of as harp-friendly as possible. In the past, when I've played this piece, choirs have provided this harp part that is oddly enough in landscape orientation, so all of the pages are horizontal rather than vertical, and the page turns in that are really problematic and frustrating. Also, there's some typos. For example, in the third movement, there's an accelerando that is missing completely, which was really a surprise to me in my first rehearsal, the first time I played it. So there's some things like that that I worked to fix. Also, I did work out all of the page turns, so obviously this is the first movement here, and it just spans 2 pages. Movement 4 also spans 2 pages, and then movements 2 and 3 each have a single page turn, which corresponds with some rests or a couple of bars of rest. Here we have part of the third movement of the piece, And you can see some of the information that I added. For example, here we have some cues for the choir, both the pitches and the text. And in that part there, the choir and the harp are really going back and forth, trading off, so it's quite helpful to know what they're doing. There are also, of course, pedal changes, and at the start of the movements there are pedal charts as well. And then in some places there's some suggested fingering or hand distribution, like here with the left hand and the right hand. So many of these things that I've added are things that frequently I find myself writing in on my parts, adding in all sorts of cues and of course pedal markings and things. So just trying to make it all as harp-oriented as possible. My edition of this part is available in my publication, Choral Repertoire Harp Parts, and this is available to purchase as either a PDF or a hard copy. I'll go ahead and put some links to distributors below in the description of this video. And I hope that you've found this overview useful and it's given you some ideas for how to tackle this harp part. Whether you're just learning it for the first time or you have an imminent performance, good luck to you with your playing of this beautiful piece of music.